Of all the gospel writers, Matthew is the only one who waxes eloquent about the end of the world, the only one who mentions a furnace of fire where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. His is the only gospel that contains the wise and foolish virgins, or the division of the sheep from the goats, or this parable about the wheat and the weeds. Of all the gospel writers, it's Matthew who most wants a clear-cut creation in which things are black and white, good or bad, in which people are faithful or wicked, blessed or cursed. It's something he has in common with the early Christians to whom our parable is addressed, or at least to them among others. One version of the parable is told to the crowds, according to Matthew, and an annotated version to the disciples themselves. Again, Matthew's discrimination between insiders and outsiders, between those with ears to hear and those without. To the insiders, the message is clear. Never mind that there seem to be a lot of weeds in the world right now. Hang in there. Be patient. When the last day comes, the wheat will be vindicated, while the seeds will go up in smoke. It may have been a comforting message at the time, but in these latter days, it tends to have the opposite effect. Matthew may have been clear that there are only two kinds of people in the world, the wheat and the weeds, but it's a clarity that escapes most of us. We who've encountered both kinds in ourselves and in our neighbors and in the world. Most of our fields are full of mixed plantings, or worse. Sometimes I think that if I examined mine closely, I wouldn't find wheat or weeds anymore. They've grown together for so long that a hybrid would be more likely, a mongrel seed that is neither one nor the other. So the business about gathering and burning the weeds tends to make me a little nervous. Maybe that's because the burning questions for me are these. Which am I? Wheat or weed? Blessed or cursed? The lovely thing about parables is that they rarely answer such questions, at least not directly. However much we want to read them like the GPS in our cars, they behave more like dreams or poems instead, delivering their meaning in images that talk more to our hearts than to our heads. Parables are mysterious, and their mystery has everything to do with their longevity. Left alone, they teach us something different every time we hear them, speaking across great distances of time and place and understanding. But Jesus does not leave this parable alone. He takes his disciples along and gives them the key. He's the sower. The field is the world. The weeds belong to the devil, and the wheat belongs to the kingdom of God. Everything equals something else, with nothing left over. When I hear it all laid out like that, it makes me wonder why he didn't just say so in the first place. Some scholars say it's how he avoided arrest. Some say it's how he winnowed his listeners. Others say he never explained his parables at all, but that those who recorded his words couldn't stand their ambiguity. So they took the liberty of making a few additions so that no one who heard them later could misunderstand. Not that it matters much, except to remind us how much we love explanations, which are, after all, so much easier than mysteries. A parable washes over me like a wave full of life and light, but an explanation lets me know where I stand. It gives me something to work with, a tool with which to improve myself and the condition of the world in general. An explanation gives me something to put on the church marquee, like the one I saw years ago. It read, "Don't let the weeds take over." The servants in our story take that message all to heart. They're so eager to please. They see something awry in their boss's field and offer to fix it. Do you want us to go and gather the weeds, they ask, wanting to be faithful servants, to be counted among the sheep, to be counted good. The weeds they're after are, well, they're darnel, Lilium tremulentum to be exact, a plant related to wheat that looks like wheat and that hides out in wheat, but that is poisonous in the end, causing blindness and even death if too many of its small black seeds turn up in the bread dough. Palestinian farmers learned to deal with it early, uprooting the darnel once or twice before harvest so that they didn't have to separate the seeds by hand. To let the wheat and the darnel grow together posed an unnecessary risk, but one that the sower in our story seems willing to take. He's eccentric even by ancient standards, reluctant to let his servants weed his field for fear they will uproot the wheat, certain that an enemy is responsible for the problem in the first place. By modern standards, he seems a little paranoid. I mean, how many of us assume that the weeds in our yards are the work of our enemies? But I have a cousin, and she assures me that the biblical account has merit. She dated a man who once took part in a similar raid on good seed while he was an undergraduate at Georgia Tech, where late one night he and his fraternity brothers sowed kudzu seeds in their rival's freshly cultivated lawn and waited with glee for the weed to take over the unsuspecting zoysia. For any of you who are not a Southerner, I should explain that kudzu is the South's version of darnel, except that it doesn't look anything like wheat. It looks instead like whatever it has recently consumed, which may include groves of pecan trees, rows of telephone poles, or even entire houses. It's possible while touring the South to believe that you're driving through Appalachian foothills when you are in fact viewing small mountains of kudzu that have taken over everything in its path. Kudzu grows as much as 12 inches in a 24-hour period, up to 50 feet in a single season, which explains its reputation as the vine that ate the South. If you're going to plant kudzu, the saying goes, drop it and run. But no one down south plants kudzu, although I know a number of folks who'd like to get their hands on the scoundrel who did. Just for the record, kudzu was brought to this country to decorate the Japanese pavilion at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876. An exotic import, it became popular as a shade plant, a hay and forage crop, and as the God-given solution to erosion after the Great Depression. Kudzu soon became the darling of the Soil Conservation Service. Between 1935 and 1942, government nurseries produced 84 million kudzu seedlings and planted them wherever they would grow. By 1943, the Kudzu Club of America had 20,000 members, and Southern belles competed for the coveted title of Kudzu Queen. Kudzu replaced cotton as the crop of the future, but the vine's chief virtue, its magnificent rate of growth, soon turned out to be its fatal flaw. Fruit growers began to complain that kudzu was choking their orchards. Farmers reported that it broke their baling machines, and railroad engineers accused it of causing trains to slip right off their tracks. It wasn't long before the kudzu nurseries shut down. The kudzu club was disbanded, and the United States Department of Agriculture demoted kudzu to weed status, a weed being defined as a plant that does more harm than good. Today, kudzu is just a nuisance, an eyesore. Maybe the reason the boss said no to the servants is that he knew they weren't skillful enough to separate the good from the bad. Like us, they couldn't always tell the difference. They might exterminate something that looks like, for all the world, like a weed, but then bend over to pick up the limp stalk and find grains of wheat falling out. Did you know that in one of the first Crusades, knights from Western Europe blew through an Arab town on their way to the Holy Land and killed everyone in sight? It wasn't until later, when they turned the bodies over, that they found crosses around most of their victims' necks. It never occurred to them that Christians came in brown as well as white. Maybe the boss also understood that the problem with separating the good from the bad is that often their lives are intertwined. That's one of the ways darnel survives, by wrapping its roots around the roots of the wheat, so that you can't yank up one without yanking up the other. No plant surgeon alive can extract the poisonous seed without killing some innocent bystanders. So my hunch is the boss felt it just wasn't worth it. Better to let them all grow together until the harvest. In first century Palestine, lumber and coal were hard to come by. The best bet for heating and cooking fuel was dried weeds or manure. By letting the weeds and the wheat grow together, farmers had almost everything they needed to make bread. The wheat for the flour, the weeds for the fire. The only other thing they need was a little patience, a little tolerance of the temporary mess, until everything was put to good use at the harvest. But for those of us living right now, that patience can be hard to come by. The weeds may still be useful to us in ways that surpass our understanding. I'm thinking about the public murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, the pardoning of convicted felon Roger Stone by the president, the refusal by many political leaders in our country to make the health and well-being of people their first priority by following the advice of the health experts, the unidentified federal agents grabbing people expressing their First Amendment rights off the streets and driving off with them into the night in Portland. All of those things. That's a real list of weeds in my book. But I'm also thinking of the incredible public response to the poison released by these events. I'm thinking of folks of all races and persuasions and political affiliations, men, women, and children, coming together like never before to express their solidarity with one another and their commitment to change things for the better. Sometimes the weeds wake the wheat up and remind them who they are, helping the wheat to remember that things can't be taken for granted, that surviving as wheat is going to take a lot of effort. Maybe the boss says no to yanking the weeds because the boss realizes that the wheat run the risk of turning into weeds themselves. It's one of the trickiest things weeds do. To get the wheat so riled up and defensive that they start acting like weeds themselves, full of prickles and poison, so angry that everything is is destroyed in a fit of righteous rage. I've found myself getting more angry than I've ever been in my life during these past 6 months. I've cursed the weeds and voiced my dismay, my pain, my hatred toward the poison being released day after day. I've cursed God. I've cursed myself for not having done more to make things better. But none of that has truly helped. I've had to remind myself that God allows a mixed field, whether I like it or not, whether I approve of it or not, whether I understand it or not. What is it that Jesus says in another part of Matthew's gospel? You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. God asks us to tolerate a mixed field too, both in the church and in the world. But this has nothing to do with being passive. It has everything to do with being active, working to love our enemies, but to do so by the best and only real solution to evil and injustice. And we do that by bearing good fruit. Our job is to do what Congressman John Lewis did all of his life, to make our business not about giving our energy to our enemies by seeking their destruction, but to give our faith and energy to reconciling the world, reconciling it to God, to establishing justice and shalom. If we'll give ourselves to that, then God will take care of the rest. Our job is to be wheat, even in a messy field. One afternoon, in the middle of the growing season, a bunch of farmhands decided to surprise their boss and weed her favorite wheat field. No sooner had they begun to work, however, than they began to argue, first about which of the wheat-looking things were weeds, and then about the rest of the weeds. Did the Queen Anne's lace pose a real threat to the wheat, or could it stay for decoration? And the blackberries, they'd be ripe in just a week or two, but they were, after all, weeds. Or were they? And the honeysuckle, it seemed a shame to pull up anything that smelled so sweet. About the time they had gotten around to debating the purple asters, the boss showed up and ordered them out of her field. Dejected, they did what they were told. Back at the barn, she took their machetes away from them, poured them some lemonade, and made them sit down where they could watch the way the light moved across the field. At first, all they could see were the weeds, and what a messy field it was. What a discredit to them and their profession. But as the summer wore on, they marveled at the profusion of growth. Tall wheat surrounded by tall goldenrod, ragweed, and brown-eyed Susans. The darnel and the poison ivy flourished alongside the Cherokee roses and the milkweed. It was a mess, but a glorious mess. And when it had all bloomed and ripened and gone to seed, the reapers came. Carefully, gently, they gathered the wheat and made the rest into bricks for the oven where the bread was baked. And the fire that the weeds made was excellent, and the flour that the wheat made was excellent. And when the harvest was over, the boss called them all together, the farmhands, reapers, and the neighbors, and she broke bread with them Bread that was the final distillation of that whole messy, gorgeous, mixed-up field. And they all agreed that it was like no bread any of them had ever tasted before. Yes, after they ate it, they all agreed it was like no bread any of them had ever tasted before. Thanks be to God. Amen.